Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back at the Arctic Circle. I've had the opportunity to be here every year, including back in Alaska before we actually had an Arctic Circle in Iceland. We did it in Girdwood, Alaska, and I want to personally thank both Alice and President Grimson for their leadership in developing an institution which is really adding considerable value to the world in its attention to the Arctic and in providing an opportunity for people to enhance their understanding of this very vulnerable and valuable place, the Arctic that we love. I do have a short PowerPoint, which is up, which is great. My main goal is to talk to you about the Science Ministerial that was held last week in Washington, D.C. But before I launch into that, I want to take just a moment to reflect upon the change in the United States in terms of its attention to this place. I can honestly say that within really the space of the last 7 or 8 years, the amount of attention that the United States has put in not only better understanding the Arctic, but also kind of getting its act together from the standpoint of agency action in the Arctic is truly remarkable. And sometimes I think when you take one step and then another step and then another step, you kind of lose track of where you started. And so I just want to reflect on it for a moment, because I think it helps explain why the Arctic Science Ministerial last week was so significant and what it was built on. So actually the first time that the United States had an Arctic strategy was 2013, not that long ago. And then it was followed in 2014 by an implementation plan that really helped agencies focus on their own responsibilities. And many of the federal agencies then launched their own strategy consistent with that overarching national strategy. Then the president signed an executive order which created the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which is chaired by John Holdren, the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and now staffed by Mark Brzezinski. And of course, the president came to Alaska last year and brought not only a lot of key people with him, but the attention of the world when he hosted the Glacier Conference in Anchorage and then traveled around Alaska. That really piqued not only his interest, but the increased commitment by our government to ask what is it that we need to do to really be a responsible steward of this important region. And that is really what gave rise to the Arctic Science Ministerial that the White House sponsored last week. It involved 25 nations, the European Union, permanent participants, that is the indigenous peoples representatives to the Arctic Council. It embraced the notion that many of the decisions that need to be made both by the public sector and the private sector as time goes by and as the Arctic becomes more and more accessible, that many of those decisions, I would argue all of them, really require an additional level of understanding beyond what we understand now about how rapidly the Arctic is changing and how we as human beings are impacting that, and what it is that we have within our power to mitigate risk and reduce negative impacts as these changes take place. So that gave rise to the need for bringing people together to ask the fundamental question, what can we do collaboratively in the Arctic science world that no one country, no one university, no one bilateral agreement, no one independent entity, whether they be business or public sector, can do alone? Now, having said that, there's been a lot of cooperation over the years, so don't get me wrong. This was really just taking all of the previous existing opportunities, agreements, and efforts to a much higher level by asking these participants beforehand, what is it that they would propose from their country's perspective that with additional cooperation and additional collaboration and additional investment, we could do better together. Over 150 submissions came in from the various governments and institutions, and at the meeting, there was an all-day discussion of what we could do together. Each of the ministers made presentations. Many of the proposals came forward in a way that really helped crystallize what it is that could be done. The participants, of course, included the 8 Arctic nations, but perhaps surprising to some was the tremendous interest from countries that aren't a part of the Arctic, but that understand increasingly how much the changes in the Arctic are impacting them. Their weather, their business, their tourism, their shipping, there are many, many other ways in which paying attention to the Arctic and better understanding the Arctic is important to the entire world. The 4 themes at the Arctic Science Ministerial are on the board, as you can read them. But what is really, really important to say is that they were broad in scope, but the proposals were much narrower in terms of deliverables. And we don't have the time to go through many of those, but I just want to briefly say that these 4 overarching themes, understanding the changes that are taking place and the challenges, strengthening our observing system, which I will just tell you, every Arctic meeting discusses how important it is to strengthen our observing system and to connect them so that data is not only available, but useful in formats that both the private sector and the public sector can use. Understanding how important it is for the communities that are kind of at the front lines of these changes, how they can improve their capacity to adapt and strengthen their resilience capacity. And then finally, using the Arctic to not only help STEM education everywhere by creating something that's really intriguing and will stimulate curiosity, but also building up the next generation of scientists and decision makers and leaders within the Arctic by putting an emphasis on STEM education. So under each of these, understanding what is going on, both in terms of permafrost and ice and glaciers, but also in terms of being able to take whatever science information is being accumulated that is incredibly expensive, I might note. I mean, doing research in the Arctic is not a simple thing. It is a very expensive thing. It is actually a high-risk activity. And so we want to make sure that to the extent that we are using all of the technologies and all of the resources, that we are connecting what we are learning in an important and effective way, and that to enable the communities that are currently experiencing tremendous change, and I will just mention the communities of Alaska that are really right now facing the question of whether or not to move, whether or not it's possible to continue to survive in the places where they have lived for a very long time, trying to find ways that we can bring technology, engineering, and collaborative decision-making informed by traditional knowledge to improve the way in which we are enabling our communities to prosper. And then finally, the concentration on youth, the concentration on the next generation of leaders. The ministerial outcomes, again, there were 150 proposals. Many of them relate to things that have already begun. For example, the German proposal for Mosaic, which basically would be a year-long observation by having the polar stern be in ice for an entire year floating in the Arctic, to be able to gather information about what's happening in the winter, which is frankly even more challenging. Bringing issues and opportunities like that to the table so that other countries can join that effort. New proposals, and I will just call out the EU, the investment that the European Union is making in a very, very comprehensive and robust observation system beyond what has been done in the past. There are many, many examples of both new ideas and expanded existing ideas that have come as a result of this effort. So if you are interested in more information, and I encourage you to do that, I want to send you to 2 websites. One of them is arctic.gov. Arctic.gov is the website of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, where you can find a variety of things, not only about the Arctic Science Ministerial, the goals report, and I will note that at the door there are a number of these available, so if you'd like to pick one up, you can, but if you don't have the opportunity, you will be able to get it on the website. The other thing that you will be able to find there, which is another product of the Science Ministerial, is something that has never been done before and is now available to you. And what it is a summary of what all of the 25 nations and the EU are doing in Arctic research right now. What their investments are, their funding agencies, their infrastructure for Arctic research, and their primary goals and objectives. So we asked all of the participants for the Science Ministerial if they would give to us a 2-page summary that would include all of those things. Obviously, that was a tough assignment to boil it down to 2 pages, but everybody did it. So there is now a document which is available online, which is a 2-page summary of Arctic science initiatives under those 4 categories for all of those 25 nations. This is an example of something that never existed before, but that will be helpful to not only the Arctic science community, but for those of you who are interested in what those results are. It will help you find the results of that work, but it may also tempt some of you in terms of investing in additional opportunities to support the science effort that is so important for decision makers. So in closing, let me just say one additional word. After listening all day during the Science Ministerial to the very heartfelt calls to action from science ministers from literally all over the world, I became once again convinced of the importance of the work that is happening here and that is happening at many other venues where people are really puzzling through what are our responsibilities to the Arctic, not just today, but our responsibilities to the Arctic for the long term. We often focus on the species in the Arctic that are ice dependent. We look at seals and polar bears and others that we call ice dependent species. And we worry about how rapidly the ecosystems are changing in terms of their survival. After that day's discussion, I just want to leave you with this thought. We are all ice-dependent species. Every human on this planet depends upon being able to keep a certain amount of ice at our 2 poles. It is the climate regulator. It's like an air conditioner that helps all of us, regardless of where we live, be able to live on a planet with a livable climate, with a sea level that we can accommodate given our infrastructure and our communities. So when we think about our responsibilities toward the Arctic, I want us to think that we, just like the polar bear, are ice-dependent species, that sense of urgency is what brings us here to this meeting. It's what brought science ministers to Washington, D.C. and the White House last week, and it's what I believe compels us to continue this important work. Thank you very much.